I used to believe that if you built something properly, if you laid the right foundations and put the right systems in place, it would hold together while you weren't looking. That was the philosophy I'd built an entire career on. 40 years in digital marketing, first as a print man who made the leap when nobody else believed in websites, then as a consultant who'd helped everyone from family-owned furniture stores to national retail chains find their footing online. I understood metrics. I understood monitoring. I understood how to know, from 10,000 kilometers away, exactly what was happening inside a business in real time. I had the dashboards. I had the access logs. I had the transaction alerts, the remote desktop sessions, the cloud-based accounting software that updated every 15 minutes. I was a man who had built his professional reputation on the premise that digital oversight was sufficient oversight, that you did not need to be physically present in a room to control what happened in it. I know now that this is not true. I know that it took AUD $347,000 and a ceiling fan with a loose blade clicking in an apartment in Naklua to teach me. And by the time the lesson was fully absorbed, nut was gone, the account was empty, and I was 60 years old and sitting in Witch Eye's office on Pattaya Klang Road, working out the arithmetic of what I had left. My name is Russell. I was 58 when I first arrived in Thailand, and 60 when I finally left. Those 2 years sit in my memory with the particular quality of time that changes everything. Not the way good years change you, quietly and in ways you're grateful for, but the way a car accident changes you. You remember the before and the after, and the specific moment of impact, and between the before and the after, everything is different in ways you're still discovering. I'm back in Perth now. I'm living in a rented flat near the beach in Cottesloe that I tell people is a lifestyle downsize, because at 60, you need less space. What I privately know is that it is the precise consequence of having been the kind of fool who built a meticulous digital monitoring system for his business, and then gave someone he was sleeping with the master password. To understand how I got there, you need to understand what my life looked like in the years before Thailand. I'd been self-employed since I was 31, which meant I'd spent nearly 3 decades making decisions that at a larger company would have required a committee, a risk assessment, and 3 rounds of sign-off. I was used to trusting my own judgment. I had good reason to trust it. The consultancy I'd built from a spare bedroom in Fremantle had grown into a 7-person operation billing respectable money for mid-market digital campaigns across Western Australia and some national clients in Sydney and Melbourne. I sold the majority stake at 54 to a media group that wanted the client list and the team and kept me on as a retained strategy consultant for 3 days a week at a rate that more than covered my costs. The plan was to use the proceeds to travel, spend 6 months in Europe, maybe buy something in Portugal or Slovenia somewhere affordable with good weather. See what life looked like when you weren't permanently tethered to a phone and a client relationship management system. My ex-wife Sandra had remarried well and moved to Melbourne, and our relationship had arrived at the comfortable indifference of people who did the right thing by divorcing before things became genuinely ugly. My son Liam was in Perth doing something in construction project management and earning more than I had at his age. My daughter Kelly was in London working in finance and visited at Christmas when the flights weren't obscene. There was nothing holding me in Perth beyond habit and familiarity, and at 57, those are reasons to leave rather than reasons to stay. I ended up in Thailand because of Craig Whitmore. Craig had been a client of mine for 8 years, running a chain of outdoor equipment stores in Perth and Bunbury, before he took his divorce settlement and his early redundancy from his majority shareholder brother and relocated to Chiang Mai at 52. For 3 years after that, he sent me photographs of himself on a motorbike on mountain roads and eating noodles in night markets and looking unreasonably healthy for a man who'd spent the previous decade eating stress for breakfast. He came back to Perth for his daughter's wedding when I was 57, and I hadn't seen him in 2 years, and he'd lost 15 kilos and was tanned the color of teak and had the easy physical posture of someone who has stopped carrying things they don't need to carry. He sat across from me at the wedding reception with a beer in his hand and looked at me the way people look at someone they feel sorry for, in a way they can't quite articulate. "Russell, mate," he said. Just go. Fly over for a month. You'll never come back. I told him that sounded like the opposite of a recommendation. He just smiled. I flew to Bangkok on a Tuesday in October. I'd booked 4 weeks, which felt like enough time to see whether Craig's enthusiasm was the genuine article or the self-justifying optimism of a man who needed to believe he'd made a good decision. It took about 48 hours to understand that he wasn't self-justifying. Bangkok in October was warm and loud and full of energy, of a kind that Perth, for all its genuine pleasures, simply didn't generate. I liked the food, which was better than anything I'd eaten in years. I liked the pace, which seemed fast and slow simultaneously, in a way that suited my particular temperament. I liked being somewhere where nobody knew me, which is a strange thing to like, but which I think older men who've been in the same place for 30 years understand. By the end of the first week, I'd extended the flight to 6 weeks. By the end of the second, I'd started looking at apartments. By December, I had arrived at what felt like a logical evolution of the situation. My consulting work was entirely portable. I was doing strategy calls with clients in Perth and Sydney from a cafe table off Sukhumvit Road, without any perceptible drop in quality of service. The cost of living differential meant that my retained consulting income, which in Perth had been comfortable, in Bangkok made me feel genuinely prosperous. I started thinking about what it would look like to establish a small satellite operation in Thailand. Nothing ambitious. A registered entity that could handle the administrative and operational work for the consultancy's expanding digital campaign production side, with a local hire to manage the day-to-day while I shuttled between Bangkok and Perth. It was a sensible business idea. I want to be clear about that, because it's easy in retrospect to make the whole thing sound like a fantasy dressed up in business language. The underlying idea was sound. The execution was where things went comprehensively wrong. I relocated to Pattaya in February because Craig had a friend there, a retired engineer named Paul, who ran a small guest house in Naklua, the quieter northern section of the city that bore no particular resemblance to the stretch of neon and noise most people imagine when they hear Pattaya. Paul's guest house was clean and well run, and he offered me a monthly rate that made the Bangkok accommodation I'd been paying look extravagant. I planned to stay 6 weeks, assess the business registration process in the eastern seaboard region, where costs were lower than Bangkok, and then make a decision. I met Nut in the 3rd week of February. She was the office manager for a small import-export firm housed in a commercial building 3 minutes' walk from the Naklua market. I was introduced to her through a man named Narong, who I'd been pointed toward by Paul's accountant as someone with practical knowledge of how foreigners navigated the Thai business registration system. Narong was mid-50s, well-connected, quietly spoken, and genuinely helpful in a way that I've since understood was both authentic and strategically motivated. He earned referral income from the lawyers and accountants he sent foreign business people to, which is a perfectly legitimate arrangement that I didn't begrudge him then and don't begrudge him now. He mentioned that the firm Nut worked for was winding down one of its divisions and that she might be available, and that she was, in his view, considerably overqualified for what she was doing. Narong was right. Nut had a degree in business administration from a well-regarded university in Khon Kaen, and had worked for 2 years for a logistics company in Bangkok before moving south for reasons she was initially vague about. She was 29 years old, and she managed the office she worked in with a precision and self-possession that I would have been happy to find in any of the staff I'd employed in Perth. Her English was functional and clear, the kind of English that gets learned from textbooks and company training programs rather than from films and conversation, which meant it was sometimes slightly formal, but was always accurate. She was from Buriram province, she told me in our first meeting, and her family were there. She sent money back each month. She said this matter-of-factly, not as a bid for sympathy, in the way you might mention any standing financial commitment. I found it straightforward, and I found her straightforward, and I found myself thinking, over the next week, that I had been looking for someone like this, and had not expected to find her in a commercial building near the Naklua market. We had 3 meetings that were strictly professional before the 4th one became dinner. I need to be precise about how I characterized this to myself at the time, because it matters. I was not looking for a relationship. I want to say that and have it be true, and I think it is mostly true. What I was looking for was a competent operational manager who understood Thai business administration. The fact that I found her pleasant company and attractive, she was calm and direct and had a dry sense of humor that emerged gradually, like something she was deciding to trust me with, I categorized as irrelevant to the professional assessment. That categorization, I understand now, was the first significant error. Not because the attraction was itself wrong, but because treating it as irrelevant meant I didn't account for it in how I was reading her, in how much weight I was giving to her presentation of herself, in how much I wanted the professional arrangement to work because the personal arrangement was becoming something I wanted. By April, I had registered a limited company through Wichai, a Thai lawyer who operated from a shophouse office on Pattaya Klang Road, and who charged rates that reflected a sophisticated understanding of what foreigners would pay for the reassurance of speaking to someone who spoke their language. The company structure was standard for foreign-operated businesses, a Thai majority shareholding with local nominees holding the required proportion, with the foreign operator maintaining de facto control through a management agreement. Wichai had done this many times. He knew what he was doing. I knew what I was doing. The company bank account was opened at Bangkok Bank in Pattaya, with Nut named as the authorized signatory for day-to-day operations, which was also standard, and which I had verified with 2 other foreign business operators in the area before agreeing to it. I set up online banking access, transaction alerts calibrated to flag any debit above 150,000 baht, and a monthly reporting requirement I'd written into Nut's employment contract. The business operated well for the first several months. I'm going to say this clearly because it's true, and because the story is easier to understand if you accept that it isn't simply a story of a naive man being tricked from the beginning. The satellite office generated real revenue. Nut managed 3 ongoing campaign production projects with a methodical efficiency I could track in the quality of deliverables and in the client satisfaction scores I was collecting. She sourced a local Thai corporate client who'd found us through a Pattaya Business Network event she'd attended without being asked to. The office costs were 40% below what I'd budgeted. By July, I was telling Ian, my accountant in Perth, that the Thailand operation was performing ahead of projections and that I was thinking of scaling it. What was also true by July was that I had stopped staying at Paul's guest house. I had been staying at Nut's apartment in Naklua 4 or 5 nights a week since May. I want to be clear that she did not push for this. The progression was gradual and felt mutual, and by the time I was spending more nights at her apartment than at the guest house, I had simply stopped thinking about it as a decision that required analysis. That was the environment in which my professional judgment about her operated. The judgment that said the transaction alerts were sufficient oversight. The judgment that said the monthly reports were adequate. The judgment that said being in Thailand but not in the office was the same as having the office under control. I was conducting a professional assessment of someone I was in a relationship with, and I was telling myself the 2 things were separate. They were not separate. They have never been separate for anyone, and I was not an exception. There were things I noticed that summer that I chose to interpret generously. In July, after I'd refused the request about the loan for Arthit's business, I noticed that Nut seemed less forthcoming for about 2 weeks. Not cold, not obviously changed, but slightly more contained, as if something had shifted in her internal calculus. I told myself she was processing the disappointment. I told myself it was a sign of maturity that she wasn't sulking openly. I didn't ask her about it, because asking would have required me to admit that I'd noticed, and I didn't want to turn a small thing into a conversation that might become a large thing. That is an exact description of how you maintain a relationship by not examining it, and it is also an exact description of how you fail to notice the person you're in a relationship with, deciding what to do about a problem you've created for them by saying no. In August, there was a transfer I should have questioned more thoroughly. 45,000 baht to a supplier called Prasert Office Solutions, described as stationery and equipment. I asked Nut about it. She showed me an invoice that looked professional. I verified the company existed in the Thai Business Registry. I approved the expense and moved on. I did not ask to see the stationery or the equipment. I think now about the fact that I did not ask to see the stationery, and I find it almost funny, except that it isn't. Craig came down from Chiang Mai for a long weekend in September. We had dinner the first night at a seafood restaurant on Jomtien Beach. Proper Jomtien, not the end nearest Pattaya proper. The end where local families come on weekends, and the prices are written in Thai rather than baht and dollar. Nut was with us. Craig was warm to her, and she was warm to him, and the dinner was enjoyable, in the easy way that dinners are enjoyable, when the food is good and the people are fine. When Nut went to the bathroom, Craig poured himself another beer and looked out at the water for a moment, and when he looked back at me, his expression was the one I recognized from early in our client relationship. The look of a man who has an opinion he is deciding whether you want to hear. "She's impressive," he said. "She is," I agreed. "You're happy?" "Very," I said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. I didn't ask him what he'd been about to say. I didn't want to hear it, and he knew that, and so we talked about Chiang Mai instead. I flew back to Perth in late October for a scheduled 6-week visit. There was banking administration that required my physical presence at a branch, and Ian had been asking for an in-person meeting for months, and Liam had been making noises about not seeing me enough, and it was my turn to fly to Kelly rather than Kelly flying to me. The 6 weeks were planned down to the week. The business was operating smoothly. Nut had full access to the accounts and was fully across the ongoing projects. I had the transaction alerts configured. I had the online banking access. I sat in the Qantas Business Lounge at Suvarnabhumi watching the gates and thinking about what I was going to have for breakfast in Perth the next morning, and I felt, with a completeness that seems absurd to me now, entirely at ease. Perth was fine. I stayed with Liam in his house in Wembley and ate home-cooked food, and felt the particular pleasure of being somewhere cold and familiar after months of heat and newness. Ian met me on the Tuesday for lunch at a place on St. George's Terrace that he'd been going to for 20 years. He was his usual careful self. Ian has been my accountant since I was 39, and I cannot imagine my financial life without his precise, unhurried professional caution, which I have at various points over the years found reassuring, and at other points found mildly exasperating. He worked through the consolidated accounts for the consultancy and the Thai subsidiary, asked sensible questions about the company structure, made careful notes. At one point he looked up from his notepad and said, "And you're comfortable with the level of access she has to the accounts?" I showed him the online banking dashboard on my laptop and explained the alert system. He looked at it for a moment. "Right," he said. He made a note. I remember noticing that the note seemed to take slightly longer than the subject warranted, and choosing not to ask what it said. I was telling myself he was being conservative in the professional way that accountants are, and that I had assessed the risk and managed it appropriately. He was right, and I was wrong, and I think part of me knew I was wrong, and chose to categorize it as professional caution rather than genuine warning. Nut and I spoke every day while I was in Perth. Video calls in the evening, my time, which was late evening hers. She gave me operational updates that were businesslike and detailed, and that I had no reason to question. The 3 ongoing client projects were on track. The local Thai client was happy with their first campaign. She was in conversation with a referral from Narong about a potential new account. The office was well. She sounded like herself. Composed, precise, occasionally dry. Our personal conversations were warm. She asked about my children and remembered the names of their partners. She told me about a good restaurant she'd found near the office and said she'd take me there when I got back. Everything was exactly what I wanted it to be, which in retrospect is the thing I should have been more suspicious of. In the 3rd week I went to Broome with Liam for 5 days. He had annual leave and suggested it, and I hadn't been to Broome since a camping trip with Sandra, when the kids were small, and the suggestion felt good. We drove the coast road up to Monkey Mia first, and came back through Carnarvon, and took our time. Mobile coverage was intermittent, and I checked the bank account twice that week from roadside rest stops, where the signal was reliable. Both times the balance looked as I expected it to look. Both times the transaction log showed only the kind of operational debits I'd come to understand as normal. I was at a rest stop outside Shark Bay, with a terrible coffee and a view of salt flats that looked like something from another planet, when I checked the account for the second time, and it looked fine, and I drank the coffee and got back in Liam's truck feeling good about how well the whole arrangement was running. We got to Broome on the Thursday afternoon and checked into a place on Cable Beach Road, and in the evening walked down to the beach because the sunset at Cable Beach in late November is something you don't skip. The beach was wide and red, and the light on the water was the kind of light that makes you feel like the world has been arranged for your specific benefit. I was standing on the sand, watching the sun make its way toward the horizon, feeling the sand still warm under my feet, when my phone buzzed with the Bangkok bank transaction notification. 280,000 baht. The heat went out of the sand immediately. I don't know how else to describe it. The physical sensation was one of temperature dropping, which is not what happened, but that is what I felt. I called Nut. Voicemail. Called again. Voicemail. The sun continued to set with complete indifference. I messaged her. I sat down on the sand, because standing felt like it required more stability than I had access to, and I looked at the transaction detail on the app. The transfer was described as a supplier payment to Pattaya Trading Co. Limited. I had never heard of Pattaya Trading Co. Limited. I had never authorized a payment to Pattaya Trading Co. Limited. The beach was emptying as the sky went dark, and I sat there with the phone and the specific quality of dread that is not yet confirmation, but is no longer doubt. The feeling of standing on something that has been solid for a long time and feeling it give slightly underfoot. She called back 40 minutes later. Her voice was level in the particular way that I had always found trustworthy, and which I now understand I should have found alarming. She sounded the way someone sounds when they have prepared what they are going to say. Pattaya Trading Co. Limited was a new equipment supplier she'd sourced through Narong. The payment was for a bulk purchase of office hardware, servers and networking equipment that would allow the office to handle more technically demanding production work. She'd been going to tell me about it on our call that evening. There was a time-sensitive discount that required immediate payment. She had made the call within her authority as operational director. She had the invoice and would send it immediately. I said I needed to see the invoice. She sent it within 20 minutes. It looked like the Prazert Office Solutions invoice from August. Same formatting, same layout, same font, different company name, and different totals. I told myself on that beach in the dark that the similarity was because she used a template, and that the invoice looked professional, and that Narong's referral was a reasonable basis for trusting a new supplier. I told myself this with a conviction that I did not actually feel, and I went back to the hotel and had dinner with Liam and told him the business was fine when he asked. The next 18 days, reconstructed later from the bank statements that I should have been watching but was not watching, went like this. On the day of the alert there was one transfer, 280,000 baht to Pattaya Trading Co. Limited. 3 days later, 195,000 baht to an account registered to Arthit Suwanarat, Nut's brother. 5 days after that, 340,000 baht to Pattaya Trading Co. Limited again. 2 days later, 87,000 baht, described as operational expenses to an account that Which Eye's contact later traced to a mobile money wallet registered to a woman named Wasana, who had no documented connection to the company. 4 days later, a further 420,000 baht to Arthit Suwanarat. And on the final day, 3 days before my return to Bangkok, a transfer of 310,000 baht to Pattaya Trading Co. Limited that brought the account to 5,000 baht, the precise minimum balance below which my alert threshold would have fired immediately, regardless of the amount. Total from the operating account, 1,632,000 baht. At the exchange rate at the time, approximately AUD $65,000. It should have ended there, but it didn't. I had made what I now understand was a catastrophic administrative error 9 months earlier, in January, when I had added Nut as an authorized third party to the Australian dollar account I held at Bangkok Bank, the account I used to receive consulting income from Perth, before converting to baht for local expenses. I had done this because there was a period in late January when I was traveling without reliable internet access, and there were 2 urgent transfers that needed to be executed locally. I had intended to remove the authorization once the business was established and the need had passed. I had not removed it. I had meant to, and I had not. And that is not a more complicated story than it sounds. The AUD account was accessed 6 times over the 4 weeks I was in Perth. The withdrawals were spaced carefully, each one timed several days apart, each one sized just below the threshold I'd set for the alert system on that account. They did not individually look alarming. Collectively, they added up to AUD $247,000, nearly all of my consulting reserves. The savings I had built over 4 decades of work and 30 years of self-employment, the cushion I had relied on when I'd sold the majority stake in the consultancy, and that I had expected to maintain for the remainder of my working life and beyond. I did not know this yet when I flew back to Bangkok. I knew about the 280,000 baht alert, and I had accepted Nut's explanation with the deliberate willingness of someone who does not want to look directly at what they already know. I did not go through the bank statements line by line on the flight home. I told myself it was because I needed to be in the office to properly assess the documentation. What I know now is that I didn't go through them because I was afraid of what I would find, and I was choosing, one last time, to be somewhere in the space between knowing and being forced to act on what I knew. The conversation at the apartment in Naklua that evening is the one I remember most clearly. She was there when I arrived. She had cooked tom kha with chicken that smelled exactly the way the restaurant near the office smelled, the one she'd told me she'd take me to when I got back. The apartment was the same as it always was. The ceiling fan over the table had a loose blade that made it click every 3rd rotation. Click, click, click. A sound I'd been meaning to have fixed for months. We ate. We talked about the office. I kept waiting to feel something definitive, either the confirmation of the suspicion or the relief of the suspicion being wrong. I felt neither. I felt the click of the fan and the warmth of the food and the presence of someone I had thought I understood. I raised the Kratai transactions after dinner. I said I'd had time to think about them on the flight, and I needed to go through the documentation in detail. I needed to physically see the equipment. I needed to understand why a purchase of that size had been made without prior authorization under the management agreement she'd signed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the equipment was at a storage facility in Rayong, and she could take me there tomorrow. I said that was fine. The fan clicked. I said goodnight and went to sleep in the apartment that I now understand I would never feel easy in again. We did not go to Rayong the next day. Early in the morning, before I had properly woken up, I heard her on the balcony speaking Thai in a low, quick voice. I came through from the bedroom and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her back. The conversation was rapid, and I caught perhaps 1 word in 10. Thai takes years to learn at the level where fast colloquial conversation becomes comprehensible. But I caught my name, which stands out in Thai the way any foreign word stands out. I caught the word ngairn, which means money. I caught the phrase rot yon mai, which means new car. And then she turned around and saw me standing there, and her face did something in less than a second that I have spent a great deal of time since trying to describe precisely. It was not guilt. It was not panic. It was the expression of someone running a very fast calculation, and the result of the calculation was a decision about how to proceed. She said it was her brother, that he was having a problem with the business. I said okay, and went back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and felt the morning light come through the curtains and understood, with a clarity that had been available to me for weeks and that I had been actively refusing, that the calculation she'd been running was not a new calculation. It was the end of one that had started some time ago. I called Wichai that morning without telling Nut. I told him I had concerns about the company accounts and I needed to understand what my legal access to the documentation was. He told me to come to his office that afternoon. I told Nut I had a client call and would be working from a coffee shop. She seemed unsurprised. I wonder now how long she had been expecting exactly this conversation. Wichai listened to me describe the transactions without interrupting. Then he asked whether I had the original banking mandate documents and whether I'd ever signed any additional signatory authorizations beyond the initial setup. I said no additional authorizations. He asked who had physical custody of the company checkbook and the company seal. I said I assumed they were in the office. He asked if I was certain. I was not certain. He looked at me with the particular professional sympathy of a man who has had this conversation before and does not enjoy having it, and he said he would like to accompany me to the bank branch the following morning. At Bangkok Bank the following day, the branch manager confirmed that all of the transfers from the company account had been executed using Nut's authorized online banking credentials. All were within the scope of her documented authority. All were, from the bank's perspective, completely valid transactions. There was nothing irregular in the banking record. The bank had done nothing wrong. Wichai had done nothing wrong. The company structure was legally sound. The problem was not a legal one. The problem was that I had designed a system of oversight that was entirely dependent on the person I was overseeing choosing to operate honestly within it. And she had not chosen that. It was in Wichai's office over the following 3 days, as he compiled the full accounting, that the picture of the AUD account withdrawals emerged. He had a contact at the bank who was able to provide transaction records across both accounts, and the picture they assembled together was thorough. Every transfer from the AUD account had been timed to avoid my alert threshold. The spacing was deliberate. The sizing was deliberate. This was not opportunistic. This was planned over weeks, possibly months, possibly from the moment I added her authorization in January, and she understood what it meant. I do not know when the plan began. I know it was not improvised. The total, AUD $347,000. I did the final sum sitting in Wichai's office on a Wednesday afternoon with a printout of both account statements and a calculator, a cup of very strong Thai coffee that went cold while I was working through the numbers. AUD, $100,000 from the company operating account. AUD, $247,000 from the personal AUD account. $247,000 that I had spent 30 years building. I sat with the printout in my hands and thought about my father, who had been a tradesman in Brisbane and who had spent his entire working life building exactly the kind of financial security I had thought I'd already achieved. I thought about what he would have said. I didn't let myself think about it for very long. I went back to the apartment that afternoon. She was there, which I had not entirely expected. Her bag was packed and sitting beside the door, which told me that she had expected to be found out eventually and had been ready for this day for some time. I had prepared things I was going to say. I had prepared the questions I needed answered, and the accusations I needed to make, and the explanations I needed to hear. None of it happened in the way I had prepared it. She was calm, in the way I had always found compelling, and which I now recognized as something different, not composure, but calculation. She said she had used the money to help her family. She said her brother needed capital to start a business, and her mother needed surgery, and that she had done what she needed to do. She said I had more money than she could accumulate in a lifetime of working for foreign businesses, and that her family's needs were real and present, and that she was not going to pretend she had done something she was sorry for. She said this without cruelty, but also without apology, with the even directness of someone stating facts. And then she picked up the bag that had been waiting by the door and she left. The ceiling fan clicked. The street made its noise. I sat in the apartment for what might have been 2 hours before I booked a flight to Perth. Wichai told me my legal options were limited in ways that were not his fault. The company transfers were within her documented authority, and the bank had no liability. The AUD account authorization was a signed document. A civil claim was possible, but Thai civil proceedings were slow, and the money had moved quickly through accounts that she had not retained control of. It had gone to Arthit, to Wasana, to wherever Kratai Trading Co. Limited existed or didn't exist, and recovering it would require success at each point in a chain that Wichai could see fraying, even before it was properly examined. He was honest with me without being unkind. I thanked him. I paid his fees from what remained in the company account. I closed the satellite office. I cancelled the company registration. Craig drove down from Chiang Mai 3 weeks after I got back to Perth. We had dinner at a seafood place in Fremantle. Outdoor tables, the kind of place Sandra and I used to go when we were still doing well. He ordered the same beer he'd ordered in Jomtien 5 months earlier, and looked at the menu for a moment, and then put it down and looked at me. I should have said more in September, he said. I told him there was nothing he could have said that I would have heard. That was true. I am certain it was true. The warning would have required me to dismantle the architecture I'd built to justify why I was in Thailand, why the arrangement was good, why this was working. Nobody dismantles that architecture because a friend looks at them with a particular expression over a beer. They dismantle it when the bank account says they have to. Ian Davies met me 2 days later at the office on St. George's Terrace. He went through the final accounting with the unhurried carefulness that I had always valued in him. At the end, he closed the folder and looked at me and said, "When I asked you in October about the level of access she had, what went through your head?" I thought about it. I said I'd thought he was being conservative. He nodded. He said, "The note I made in October said, consider whether the trust matches the exposure. I should have said that to you directly. I told him it would have been the right thing to say. I didn't tell him that it would not have changed anything, because I don't know if that's entirely true. I like to think there is a version of October where Ian says that sentence, and I think about it seriously and change the account authorization that afternoon. I don't know if that version of me exists. I know that the version of me who sat across from Ian in October and decided he was being conservative is the version who was actually there. I am 60 years old. My liquid assets, after the loss, and after legal fees, and after the cost of closing the Thai entity and settling the outstanding company tax obligations, are approximately AUD $18,000. I have the retained consulting income, which continues and which will rebuild things eventually, probably, if I'm careful, and if nothing else goes wrong. I am being careful. I have the flat in Cottesloe. I have Liam nearby and Kelly's voice on the phone on Sundays. I have Craig's photographs from Chiang Mai, which he continues to send, and I look at them now with a kind of warmth that is not untouched by the understanding that Thailand was the best and worst thing that happened to me in my 50s, and that I will probably never go back, which is a loss of a different kind that I haven't finished processing. What I know and what I want to say directly to anyone who is reading this in a situation that resembles mine is this. The digital monitoring tools I built were real, and they worked within the limits of what they could monitor. They monitored transactions that went through formal channels. They could not monitor intent. They could not monitor timing. They could not monitor a woman who understood exactly what the alert thresholds were and structured every transfer to sit just below them. They could not account for the simple human variable, which is that the person being monitored has to choose to operate honestly within the system for the system to be worth anything. I am a man who spent 40 years understanding how businesses work online, and I gave someone access to my accounts and trusted the alerts to catch what my presence would have caught. And she knew, I believe she knew from the first month, that I was not going to walk through the door at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday and check the petty cash. She knew I was on a dashboard. She knew what a dashboard can see and what it cannot. She planned accordingly. The rules of trust and money are not suspended because you are somewhere interesting, and the food is good, and the person you are giving the money to makes the risk feel worth taking. They are the same rules everywhere. I knew that. I knew it intellectually in the way you know things that you have not yet paid to learn. I know it differently now. I know it in the way you know things after you have paid the full price. If you are thinking of establishing a business in a country where you do not live, with a local partner who is doing the physical work you cannot do remotely, get on the plane regularly. Show up without announcing it. Not because you don't trust the person, because the simple fact of being someone who might show up changes the calculation for everyone, including people who have no intention of taking anything. Presence is not a substitute for trust, but absence is the condition that makes trust exploitable. I outsourced my presence to a dashboard, and I paid the price that you pay for that mistake. I paid it precisely once, which is the only number of times you can afford to pay it at 60, with AUD $18,000 in the bank, and a rented flat near the beach. Someone asked me recently, a mate of Liam's, who'd heard the story secondhand, whether I was angry at her. I thought about it for longer than he expected. The honest answer is that the anger came and went within the first month, which surprised me. What replaced it was something quieter and more permanent, a kind of structural wariness that I carry now the way you carry the memory of a bad fall, not in your thoughts, but in how you hold yourself when you're near stairs. I don't know if that's wisdom or damage. I suspect it is both. The ceiling fan in the apartment in Naklua probably still clicks. I hope whoever lives there now has fixed the blade. I kept meaning to, and I never did, and I find, for reasons I couldn't adequately explain, that I think about that fan more often than I think about the money.